Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, sometimes vacations just don't always go as planned, and if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you're in the seats with, once more, as always. My name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast, where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and conversational fashion, because, quite frankly, that's just how we do things around here. And if you like how we do things around here, I'm assuming you do, you're listening to us right now, you can subscribe to the podcast. You can find us over on Amazon, Apple, Spotify, Google, basically wherever you get your podcasts. It's all good. And plus, we subscribe, we archive all of our episodes over at our YouTube channel as well. And if you can like and subscribe us there as well, that would be great. Also, you can find us on the social media, as the kids call it. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at either at In The Seats or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of fun updates. And finally, and I do dare say most importantly, because it's where it all began, pay us a visit over at In The Seats, intheseats.ca, for all the latest and greatest from the world of television, film, basically the moving image in all its forms, because that's what we love to write about, and we love it when you come read about it. So please come on by. On this episode, we've got an interesting one. We are diving into a new film, a new Canadian horror film, indie horror. We love our Canadian indie horror here at In The Seats, called The Retreat, excuse me. I get these names mixed up sometimes. It is called The Retreat. But it's a story of a couple who basically goes on vacation and has to find themselves fighting off a bunch of psychotic rednecks, hell bent on killing them. And it's very well done, but it's also very subversive. Not subversive, but it's incredibly well executed, and it's really interesting because it tells it from the perspective of a lesbian couple, and it is giving us a story that is really sort of on one end, I don't want to say playing it straight because that's a bad pun, but it's a straight horror movie. It's not trying to be overt about the couple's sexuality, but given the militant serial killers that are out to get them, it is very much an LGBTQ story, and it's a very natural and it's a very honest representation of a lesbian couple, and we don't always get those in horror movies these days, and I think it's an important thing to have that sort of thing, which is why we sat down and we talked with writer Alyson Richards just about the idea and the premise of the story and how they were hoping to be sort of play it as a straight and honest horror movie, but also have a bit of a message to it at the same time, which is really kind of brilliant when you watch it all sort of play out. And we talked about that, her relationship with director Pat Mills, who she's worked on with a couple of other things, and just horror in general, and why it's such a fertile ground to play in when it comes to being a storyteller. And I think we had a great talk, so I hope you enjoy it, but I hope you enjoy the movie too. Check it out on all VOD platforms today. It is called The Retreat. The Retreat. I won't screw that up again. It is The Retreat. It's on VOD now. Go check it out. But first, enjoy our conversation with Alyson. Now, obviously, first off, congratulations on the movie. I loved it because, it's honestly, it's a little, for me, it's a little genius because on one end, it's a straight horror movie. On the other end, it's playing as almost borderline revenge fantasy documentary sort of terribleness all at the same time. I'm kind of curious. Can you walk me through sort of the initial inspiration for the story?
Yes. I'm first and foremost, I'm going to say I love your reaction. If that could just be the reaction, you nailed what we were going for. So thank you. That's great. The genesis started ages ago. So kind of two things were happening simultaneously. One is I've always been a big horror fan, as has Pat Mills, the director. And so a movie called High Tension came out. And loved it because it was, full of high tension. It was great. But then of course it has, spoiler alert, it's like, it's the crazy lesbian. And so I think, as a queer horror fan, I was getting, like, oh, come on, really? This is what we're doing now. So I think I really wanted to do, an entertaining horror movie that had queer characters that, weren't crazy, didn't turn on each other, that there was no big kind of twist that was kind of the thing. And then I was away on a sort of beautiful wilderness, like cabin in the woods wilderness retreat with my wife. We were in the middle of nowhere. We'd rented this really beautiful, picturesque, serene cabin. And we never saw anybody, but we constantly felt like we were being watched. And we'd go for walks and we'd come back and there'd be like little notes and little like, here's a basket of bread. So clearly something, and my active imagination just started thinking, who are these people? Do they like us? Do they hate us? And then came up with this idea.
Well, and I mean, I think that's the other thing too. Like, it's not trying to, and I mean, the other thing it's not doing, it's not going into any sort of Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 kind of areas in trying to be overt with the fact that it's trying to tell an LGBTQ story. And it's real. But I like, for me watching this, like, I was struck at just, I mean, a little sad too, but just the importance of, having, a lesbian couple on screen who weren't sort of quote unquote trying to be lesbian. They were just being people.
Yeah.
How important was it for you to sort of have a horror movie, but just have sort of normal representation at the same time?
Super important. And it's funny. It was really important because I feel like you don't see that a lot. And I think, myself, my kind of queer family community, I feel like a lot of people are just sort of regular folks in many ways. And so representation hasn't always equated that. So I think, that was extremely important to have sort of, fully fleshed out characters. And I think also too that, they were in a relationship that wasn't perfect or disastrous,
Right.
It sort of had some complications because that's, often the truth.
Something else I love about this is, I mean, especially when films are trying to be representative, that felt like a tongue twister. I don't know why. But it's not one of those things where it's trying to be overt or trying to sort of make a statement. And I mean, as much as horror has done the community, maybe, I don't want to say wrong, but maybe a little, misrepresented in many ways, horror also seems like the first avenue where you can sort of get it right. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, what is it about the horror genre that allows for sort of freedom on both ends of the spectrum, really, to sort of take it to a bad extreme, but also take it to sort of an almost a real life extreme?
That's a great question. For me, as a long time horror fan, I feel like, and if you look at, if you go to horror festivals or conventions, it's like outsiders, underdogs,
Totally.
weirdos,
Yeah.
and I feel like that and this is also too why it was important to us to make this, movie, because there's also there's so many queer horror fans out there, so I think, I don't know. I mean, I think horror audiences are the best audiences, and I would say are really open to experimentation and pushing the envelope and trying something different. So I think there's a lot of freedom to play in horror. There's also disasters in horror, but I think there is a lot of room to play and a lot of support.
No, for sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it definitely feels like this is a movie that you needed Pat with as well to sort of do it together. And I mean, obviously you guys have had a working relationship on a few different projects. How important was it to be able to not only tell this story, but tell it with Pat, who's been a frequent collaborator?
It was imperative. I love Pat. This is our third movie together. We're both gay. We came up together, so we really wanted to do this together. And I think he did such a great job directing it. So I'm very grateful to him. But yeah, I think he's also a big horror fan. So we really came from it as genre fans, being like, hey, we never see ourselves. Let's change that.
And I mean, I think that's the thing that I loved, because I mean, even sort of at the beginning of the movie, as they're driving up to the house, I'm like, well, of course the LGBT community can have an Evil Dead house. They deserve one. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right? Yeah, amazing.
I'm kind of curious, especially just as you're fleshing out the story, because I was struck by just how well it was shot and how beautiful it was. Like, were you like writing in a lot of those very sort of sly nods to the genre, just in terms of the look of the film?
Definitely. I think, as Pat often says, the, autumnal thriller. So it was like, I think it wanted to live in that world, and part of it, going back to, there's not a huge, spoiler alert, there's not really a huge twist. Like, it was like, as you said, we wanted to make kind of like a very straightforward horror. David Sherman is the cinematographer, and he's amazing, and what he can do with very little, but also, his demeanor is fantastic. So he's just a great guy, and I think made it look fantastic.
No, and I mean, this is one of those things about this film. It's like, it's a very simple premise. Like you said, it's very straightforward, but there is some real genius to it. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, and maybe even from Pat's perspective, like during the process of it all, was there a moment when you knew, okay, it's working?
Right now, when I'm talking to you, hearing you say works. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have so much respect for actors. I feel like Tommy, Amber Peary, and Sarah Allen were so great. If it was cast differently, I don't know if we'd have the same film. I think their performances, their ability to go to places, to be so vulnerable. Because it's funny, in my mind, I was like, this will be so fun. We're gonna make a horror movie. It was grueling because, they have to go through it and they have to get there emotionally. And I just felt like such an asshole. I was like, I can't believe I wrote this and I'm making these people go through this experience. So I think that was eye-opening to me, but I think they brought such real performances to it that that's what seeing them perform it, that was when I realized that we had something that was working.
Well, and we get so invested in their journey, and I mean, we get even so repelled by Rossif and Aaron, because their characters are so unredemptive, and they're just so, it's that polar of terrible that we needed our heroines to sort of fight against, and it's the perfect blend.
Yeah. Yeah, they were great. And of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, the loveliest people, Rossif and Aaron, are so nice.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So and good sports for being so terrible in the movie. Yeah.
Now, I mean, this is a silly question, but this is something I always like to ask.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think back to sort of the younger years and pick out like a moment, or even like a movie or a show or a piece of work in your life that was sort of the formative moment where the light bulb went off and you went, okay, I got to do this. I want to be a storyteller?
So I went and saw, I've always loved movies. That was, escapism, the big, grew up on sort of like the late 80s blockbuster kind of, popcorn movies. I saw a documentary on the photographer, Robert Mapplethorpe, at the Bloor Cinema in Toronto. And it was preceded by a short film that Don McKellar directed. And
we might have been in the same show.
Really? Yeah. So the documentary blew my mind because it was just like, what is happening? And then there was a Q&A for this short film. And it was, and at the time I was obsessed with like Bruce McDonald's early films, Highway 61, and then up pops, Don McKellar and the lead of Highway 61. And I was like, what? It was the first time that it connected for me that people made movies. I think prior to that, it was always something that happened in Hollywood that was far away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was the first time when I was like, oh, this is something I could do. This is so cool. That was kind of the moment for me.
Now, I mean, I'm curious because, well, we've talked about it, and other people will talk about this being a movie of, sort of representing the community and just trying to have at least sort of proper representation on screen. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective, because to me, this feels like the right step to representation, because it doesn't feel like it's trying to be representation. It's just being a movie. For you as a storyteller, do you think that's sort of the place we need to get to, where we're not thinking about whether it's a lesbian couple or it's a queer couple or a whoever couple, where it's just people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I will say it was important to us to have queer people telling a queer story. Like that was important to us. I think that but yeah, I mean, I think representation in many ways is changing for the better. And I think that more people are getting access to being able to tell stories, to tell their own stories. And in general, I think society has less of an appetite for these kind of, stock,
right.
These characters that aren't authentic. I think people, there's so much that I don't think would work. I mean, obviously there's things that, I watched as a kid, like some of my favorite movies that I look at today. I'm like, I can't even believe this was made. And I think you're seeing it as recent as stuff made 5 years ago that, is changing. So I think that's great. I think it's really nice to see that happening.
Yeah, I think the days of using exposition as a rubber mallet to hit the audience over the head with are pretty well over, or at least hopefully pretty well over. But I think that's it for me, though, Alyson. I just want to say thank you again for the time, and thank you again for the time, and congratulations again on the movie. This was a lot of fun, and the film's a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. I think the Zoom is zooming at the end. You're breaking up a little bit, but I think
I'll fix it in post-production.
Yeah, totally. Anyways, really nice to chat, David. Thank you.
Nice to chat with you. Thanks again, and congratulations again on the film.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. You can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.